Backwards planning is a way of thinking about your course that allows you to determine what you want students to have achieved at the end and then build your course accordingly. Most of us don't plan in a backwards way. Because we're content specialists in higher education, we think a lot about what content we want to cover. We think a little bit less about how we intend to teach that, particularly what kind of learning activities we want to use so we can have our students develop that understanding for themselves, and probably also less about the testing or assessment pieces of it. We know we need to have a test, but we don't necessarily plan what's going to be on that assessment before we teach the course the first time. This causes a series of problems in a face-to-face course in higher education, but it causes even more in an online environment. If you've built your course around content and not thought so much about the learning experiences or the assessment, you'll find your students questioning where can they find information. Maybe you've got it in folders for them and they have to go and get it. You haven't had so much thinking necessarily about a sequence of experiences that your students are going to have that will ensure that they're understanding the key things you want them to learn. Another thing that often happens if you think a lot about content and not so much about the teaching or the assessment is that your expectations may not be completely clear to students because you may not have thought in advance, what do you want them to do and why do you want them to do it? You'll find yourself filling in those gaps as you go along. The final problem is you have what's called an alignment issue, which means you may know the content that you want students to acquire, but you're not necessarily thinking about which process of teaching that is most likely to mean that students understand it. And you're probably also not thinking, what is the best way to measure if my students have the learning I intended for them to have? When you're designing for an online environment, you actually want to start by really clearly articulating what you want at the end. And that's called understanding by design. This is Wiggins and McTighe, where this comes from. A module objective is a way that you state, starting with your first verb, what you intend your students to be able to do. So you might say that it's important for your students to be able to assess which is the best approach in solving a certain type of problem. If you know that that's the kind of thing that you want as your module objective, that then tells you a bunch of things from an understanding by design perspective. It says, well, if your goal is to see if they can assess the best approach, then the evidence that you would want if they were successful was information where they are assessing something and telling you why they think it is better. So maybe you're going to give them a case and say, what's the right course of action here and how do you know? Or a design problem and say, what's the right course of action here? How do you know? Or a legal issue and look at them citing precedent and making a good compelling argument for the direction. Because you knew your modules up front and by thinking about the objective, then you're able to think about what am I going to assess at the end. Once you know that you're going to be accepting, for example, that case that has a reasoned argument behind it, then it tells you what do my students need to learn. Well, they're going to need to learn the basic content that they're going to argue about, but they're also going to need to learn to practice that sort of thing. So my learning materials might be some readings that I do around the content. They might be videos around the content or step-by-step processes, but they're also going to need to practice that argument building. They're going to need to learn processes for weighing how things are more or less important. Because you started with that module objective and you asked yourself, what will I accept as evidence of forward progress? It was much easier than in an online environment to design learning materials and learning activities which are aligned with your intent. When you think through that in advance, you will build much more coherent and easy to understand online instructions because it's really clear to you what the sequence of behaviors you're looking for are. And you'll find yourself knowing that in advance and flagging it well, which is an essential thing in an online environment because you can't just fix it in class each day the way you would in a face-to-face environment. You can't add additional details, can't backtrack the same way. All those things require a tremendous amount of work. So understanding by design in advance, thinking about how you want to end so that you can figure out what you need to do before it is how you design a good online course.